The date was around 1773 or 1774, when Ona Maria Judge was born at Mount Vernon, the sprawling Virginia plantation of George Washington. The precise date of her birth, like so many details about enslaved people's lives, was never recorded with any care. What mattered to the Washingtons wasn't when she was born, but rather what she could produce and how she could serve. Ona's mother was Betty, an enslaved seamstress who belonged to the estate of Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis. Betty was skilled in her craft, a woman of mixed European and African descent who spent her days spinning thread, weaving fabric, and sewing garments for both the Washington family and the enslaved people who worked the plantation. Her expertise with textiles meant she worked inside the mansion house at Mount Vernon, a position that kept her closer to the plantation's domestic center, but did nothing to diminish the brutality of her bondage. Ona's father was Andrew Judge, a white English tailor from Leeds who arrived at Mount Vernon in 1772 as an indentured servant. Washington had hired Judge to work as a tailor on the estate, and it was there that he encountered Betty. We don't know whether their relationship was consensual or coerced. What we do know is that in the 18th century, enslaved women had virtually no power to refuse the advances of white men, whether they were indentured servants or plantation owners. The historical record is silent on the nature of Betty and Andrew's relationship, but it produced a daughter. Andrew Judge completed his 4-year indenture and left Mount Vernon sometime in the 1780s, moving to Alexandria to start his own farm. He never maintained contact with Betty or Ona. Under Virginia law, children inherited the legal status of their mothers, which meant that despite being predominantly of European heritage, Ona Judge was born into slavery. Her light skin, freckled complexion, and bushy black hair would mark her throughout her life as someone caught between worlds, but the law saw her clearly. She was property. Ona spent her early childhood at Mount Vernon with her mother, learning the basics of domestic work and helping Betty with simple tasks. She had siblings. Her half-brother Austin, Betty's eldest son from an earlier relationship, had been born before Martha Washington arrived at Mount Vernon. Betty later had 2 more children with Thomas Davis, a white weaver who worked at the plantation. Tom Davis and Betty Davis, as they were called, bore their father's surname in the plantation records. Ona also had a younger half-sister named Delphi, born around 1779. For enslaved children at Mount Vernon, family bonds existed in the shadows of constant separation. Parents worked from dawn until dark, and children could be moved or sold at any moment according to the whims of their owners. When Ona was about 10 years old, around 1784, Martha Washington brought her into the mansion house. The official story was that Ona would serve as a playmate for Martha's granddaughter, Nellie Custis, but the reality was that Ona's childhood was over. She was being trained as Martha Washington's personal maid, a position that would consume the next dozen years of her life. Like her mother, Ona proved to be skilled with a needle, becoming what contemporaries called the perfect mistress of her needle. This expertise wasn't just a talent, it was a survival skill, a way to make herself valuable enough to avoid the brutal field labor that killed so many enslaved people before they reached middle age. As Martha Washington's personal attendant, Ona's responsibilities were all-consuming. She helped Martha bathe and dress each morning. She maintained Martha's wardrobe, cleaning and mending garments. She organized Martha's personal belongings and stood ready to fulfill any request at any hour of the day or night. The work demanded constant vigilance and an ability to anticipate Martha's needs before they were spoken. In the language of the time, Ona was Martha's body servant, a term that captured the suffocating intimacy of the relationship. She was expected to regulate Martha's moods, to smooth over any inconvenience, to make the First Lady's life as painless as possible. In return, the Washingtons believed they treated Ona well. They would later express shock and betrayal when she fled, unable to comprehend that bondage itself was provocation enough. Everything changed in 1789 when George Washington was unanimously elected as the first President of the United States. Washington was reluctant to leave Mount Vernon, his beloved estate, but duty called. When he departed for New York City, then the nation's temporary capital, he took 7 enslaved people with him. Ona Judge, now 15 years old, was among them. She had never left Virginia before, and suddenly she found herself in one of the largest cities in America. The contrast must have been staggering. New York teemed with merchants, sailors, artisans, and laborers from around the world. The streets buzzed with commerce and conversation in multiple languages. And, crucially for Ona, New York had a significant population of free black people, individuals who had escaped bondage or been manumitted, who moved through the city as something approaching citizens. In November 1790, the federal government relocated to Philadelphia, and the Washington household moved with it. 8 enslaved people now served at the President's house on High Street, and Ona continued her duties as Martha's personal maid. But Philadelphia presented complications that Washington hadn't fully anticipated. Pennsylvania had passed the Gradual Abolition of Slavery Act in 1780, establishing that any enslaved person brought into the state would be automatically freed after 6 months of continuous residence. The law had loopholes. Members of Congress and federal officials were technically exempt, but even that exemption required that enslaved people not establish continuous residency for more than 6 months. Washington understood the threat this law posed to his human property. In April 1791, he wrote to his secretary, Tobias Lear, laying out a strategy to circumvent Pennsylvania's abolition law. Every 6 months, Washington would send his enslaved workers on contrived trips back to Virginia or out of state, resetting the residency clock before they could qualify for freedom. It was a calculated deception, a systematic abuse of legal loopholes designed to keep human beings in bondage while Washington himself resided in the birthplace of American liberty. The other slave-holding officials in Philadelphia employed similar tactics, and no one in the federal government challenged them. The contradiction was stark and apparently invisible to those who benefited from it. The nation's capital sat in a city that was moving toward abolition, but the men who wrote documents about universal rights and human dignity couldn't imagine extending those principles to the people they enslaved. For Ona Judge, life in Philadelphia was dramatically different from anything she had known at Mount Vernon. The city had a large and active free black community, and she had opportunities to interact with these individuals when she went to market or attended public events. The Washingtons occasionally gave Ona small amounts of cash to attend plays, circuses, and other entertainments. Washington's account books record purchases for Ona's clothing, fine gowns, shoes, stockings, and bonnets, befitting her visible position in the president's household. To outsiders, it might have appeared that Ona lived a privileged life compared to field workers. She wore quality clothing, attended cultural events, and worked in close proximity to the nation's most powerful people. But privilege is not freedom. No amount of fine fabric could change the fundamental reality that Ona was property, that her body and her labor belonged to someone else, that she could be sold or given away at any moment without her consent. Philadelphia's Quaker abolitionist community was particularly active during these years, and their arguments against slavery circulated throughout the city. Ona heard these ideas. She made connections with members of the free black community, friendships that would prove crucial when the moment came to act. She also witnessed something that must have planted seeds of possibility in her mind. In February 1797, Hercules, the Washingtons' head cook, and an enslaved man renowned for his culinary skills, successfully escaped from Mount Vernon and was never recaptured. If Hercules could disappear, perhaps she could too. The trigger for Ona's escape came in March 1796, when Martha Washington's eldest granddaughter, Eliza Parke Custis, announced her engagement to Thomas Law. Eliza was 20 years old, known to be intelligent but also temperamental and difficult. She was marrying an Englishman 20 years her senior, a wealthy businessman who had worked for the East India Company and who already had 3 children from a previous relationship in India. As a wedding gift, Martha Washington decided to give Ona to her granddaughter. When Ona learned of this plan, her calculations changed instantly. She later explained that she was determined never to be her slave. Ona had heard the talk among the enslaved women at the president's house about Eliza's volatile temper and Thomas Law's questionable reputation. She understood what this transfer meant. If she went to Virginia with the Laws, she would never have another opportunity to escape. She would spend the rest of her life in bondage. Her children would be born into slavery, and she would die as someone else's property. On May 21, 1796, as the Washingtons prepared to return to Mount Vernon for the summer, Ona Judge made her move. The timing was deliberate. The household was in the chaos of packing, and the Washingtons would soon realize she was gone regardless. She had already made her preparations, quietly packing her belongings and arranging with friends in Philadelphia's free black community to help her escape. That evening, while George and Martha Washington sat down to dinner, Ona Judge walked out of the president's house. She later recalled, "Whilst they were packing up to go to Virginia, I was packing to go, I didn't know where, for I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I should never get my liberty. I had friends among the colored people of Philadelphia, had my things carried there beforehand, and left Washington's house while they were eating dinner." Her friends took her to the docks along the Delaware River, where she boarded a ship called the Nancy. The captain was John Bowles, a man who regularly sailed between Philadelphia, New York, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Whether Bowles acted out of moral conviction or for payment, he agreed to carry Ona north to freedom. She didn't reveal his name until decades later, after his death, protecting him from potential prosecution. The voyage took 4 or 5 days, covering about 300 miles along the Atlantic coast. Ona spent those days trying not to draw attention, knowing that anyone who recognized her could destroy everything. When the Washingtons discovered Ona's absence, their reaction was immediate and telling. They were furious, confused, and felt personally betrayed. 2 days after her escape, Frederick Kitt, the hired steward at the president's house, placed an advertisement in the Philadelphia Gazette and Daily Advertiser. The notice described Ona in detail. Ona Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled, with very black eyes and bushy black hair. She is of middle stature, slender, and delicately formed, about 20 years of age. She has many changes of good clothes of all sorts, but they are not sufficiently recollected to be described. The advertisement offered a $10 reward for her capture and return. Most revealing was the notice's claim that There was no suspicion of her going off, nor no provocation to do so. George and Martha Washington genuinely couldn't comprehend why Ona would flee. They believed they had treated her well, given her fine clothing, allowed her to attend entertainments, and kept her close to the family. They thought of themselves as benevolent slaveholders, the kind who treated their human property with kindness. The idea that slavery itself was the provocation, that being owned was sufficient reason to risk everything, never seemed to occur to them. Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was unlike any place Ona had ever known. The city had a population of about 5,000 people, including approximately 360 free black residents and virtually no enslaved workers. The community of free black people in Portsmouth had experience helping fugitives, and Ona found lodging with a free black family. She secured work as a domestic servant, though the labor was significantly harder than what she had done for Martha Washington. Instead of needlework and attending to one woman's personal needs, Ona likely scrubbed floors, washed laundry, cooked meals, and performed all the physically demanding tasks that kept households running. It was exhausting work, but it was work she chose, labor performed for wages rather than under the lash. For a few months, Ona must have felt something like safety. But in the summer of 1796, while walking through Portsmouth's marketplace, she encountered someone from her past. Elizabeth Langdon, the daughter of New Hampshire Senator John Langdon, recognized her. Elizabeth was a friend of Nellie Custis, Martha Washington's youngest granddaughter, and had visited the president's house. When Ona saw Elizabeth, she tried to brush past without acknowledgement, but it was too late. Elizabeth knew who she was, and she knew the Washingtons were looking for her. The news traveled quickly. Senator Langdon, despite being a Revolutionary War hero and despite New Hampshire's growing abolitionist sentiment, felt obligated to inform President Washington that his fugitive slave had been found. Washington's response revealed both his determination to reclaim his property and his awareness that the situation required delicacy. He couldn't simply send slave catchers to Portsmouth to seize Ona by force. The political climate in New Hampshire was hostile to slavery, and Washington feared that violently kidnapping a young woman from a northern city could damage his reputation and create a public relations disaster. Instead, he worked through intermediaries. On September 1, 1796, Washington wrote to Oliver Wolcott, Jr., his Secretary of the Treasury, asking him to contact Joseph Whipple, the customs collector in Portsmouth. Whipple owed his position to the Washington administration, and the president was calling in that debt. Whipple tracked Ona down using a deceptive strategy. He spread word that he was looking to hire a domestic servant for his wife, and when Ona learned of this opportunity, she met with him to discuss the position. Whipple began asking personal questions, the kind that would be unusual in a job interview, questions designed to verify her identity. Ona grew suspicious and fell silent. Finally, Whipple confessed that he had been contacted by President Washington. But Whipple also said he wanted to help her, that he would try to negotiate on her behalf. He asked why she had fled, and Ona told him the truth. She said that a thirst for complete freedom had been her only motive, that there had been no seduction by any Frenchman as Washington had suggested in his letters. She would return to Virginia, she said, but only if the Washingtons would promise to free her after their deaths. When Whipple communicated this condition to Washington, the president's response was unequivocal. The offer was totally inadmissible. Washington wrote that it would neither be politic or just to reward unfaithfulness with a premature preference. The language is remarkable. Ona's desire for freedom was characterized as unfaithfulness, as if loyalty to one's enslaver should supersede the fundamental human desire for self-determination. Washington instructed Whipple to seize Ona and put her on a ship bound for Virginia, but only if it could be done without exciting a mob or riot. The president wanted his property back, but he wanted to maintain his dignity even more. Whipple, apparently troubled by the situation and aware of the strong anti-slavery sentiment in Portsmouth, made only half-hearted attempts to continue the pursuit. Ona had told him she would meet him at the docks to board a ship back to Philadelphia, but when the appointed time came, she never appeared. She had bought herself time with a lie, and Whipple didn't press the matter further. On January 14, 1797, Ona Judge married a free black sailor named John Staines, known as Jack. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Samuel Haven, the minister of the South Church Congregational Church in Portsmouth. Marriage offered Ona some additional legal protection, though it couldn't erase her status as a fugitive. Jack Staines made his living at sea, work that was decent but sporadic and seasonal. To help make ends meet, Ona continued her domestic work, and the couple took in a boarder to supplement their income. The following year, around 1798, Ona gave birth to a daughter they named Eliza. She was building a life, creating the kind of family and future that slavery had denied her. But George Washington had not forgotten. In August 1799, with his presidency ended and his time at Mount Vernon running short, Washington made one final attempt to recapture Ona Judge. He wrote to his nephew, Burwell Bassett, Jr., Martha Washington's nephew, asking him to seize Ona during an upcoming business trip to New Hampshire. Washington gave Bassett clear instructions. He had orders to take Ona by force and carry her back to Virginia if persuasion failed. Bassett traveled to Portsmouth that September and successfully located Ona's home. When he arrived and knocked on the door, Ona may have been holding her infant daughter. Bassett used every argument he could muster to convince her to return. He even promised that the Washingtons would free her once she came back to Virginia. Ona's response was direct and unambiguous. "I am free now," she said, "and choose to remain so." Bassett, accustomed to black people obeying his commands without question, was stunned by her refusal. He returned to the home of Senator John Langdon, where he was staying as a guest. That evening, over dinner, Bassett confided his plan to kidnap Ona by force, as Washington had authorized. But John Langdon, despite his family's history of slaveholding, despite his political relationship with Washington, made a different choice. Langdon had recently freed all the enslaved people in his household and rehired them as paid workers. He wasn't an abolitionist, not in the radical sense, but he was uncomfortable with the idea of a violent kidnapping in his city. Langdon secretly sent word to Ona through one of his servants, warning her that Bassett planned to seize her before midnight. Ona hired a horse and carriage and fled 8 miles to Greenland, New Hampshire, where she took refuge with the Jack family, free black residents who sheltered her until Bassett left Portsmouth empty-handed. Jack Staines was at sea during this crisis, unable to protect his wife and child, but Ona's network of allies in the free black community saved her. 4 months later, on December 14, 1799, George Washington died at Mount Vernon after a brief illness. Washington's will directed that the 124 people he personally enslaved should be freed after Martha Washington's death. It was a gesture that many saw as evidence of Washington's moral discomfort with slavery, a final attempt to reconcile his principles with his practices. But the gesture was incomplete, and ultimately insufficient. The will said nothing about the dower slaves, the people like Ona who technically belonged to the Custis estate rather than to Washington himself. Martha Washington couldn't legally free these individuals without reimbursing the Custis heirs. In December 1800, fearing that some of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon might hasten her death to gain their freedom, Martha signed a deed of manumission freeing Washington's enslaved workers, effective January 1, 1801. But the dower slaves remained in bondage, and when Martha died in 1802, they were divided among her grandchildren. Ona's younger sister Delphi was inherited by Eliza Park Custis Law, the very fate Ona had risked everything to avoid. After Washington's death, no one from the Washington or Custis families made further attempts to recapture Ona Judge Staines. But legally, she and her children remained fugitives. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which Washington himself had signed into law, enslaved people could be pursued and captured across state lines. The law made it a federal crime to assist escaped slaves and allowed slave catchers to operate in every state and territory. Ona's children, born in freedom in New Hampshire to a free father, were still considered property of the Custis estate under the legal doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, which held that a child's status followed the mother's condition. Freedom for Ona meant constant vigilance, a life lived in the knowledge that everything could be taken away at any moment. The years that followed brought both joy and devastating loss. Ona and Jack Staines had 2 more children after Eliza, a son they named William, and another daughter they called Nancy, perhaps naming her after the ship that had carried Ona to freedom. Jack worked at sea when he could find employment, and Ona continued doing domestic work to support the family. But in 1803, just 6 years after their marriage, Jack Staines died. The New Hampshire Gazette announced his death on October 22, 1803. Ona was left a widow at approximately 30 years old, alone with 3 young children and no steady income. She briefly found a live-in position with the Bartlett family in Portsmouth, but eventually moved with her children to live with the Jack family in Greenland, the same family that had sheltered her during Burwell Bassett's kidnapping attempt. Work was scarce for a black woman in early 19th century New Hampshire. In August 1816, unable to provide for her daughters, Ona was forced to send Eliza and Nancy to work as indentured servants with a neighbor. Her son William is believed to have left home in the 1820s to become a sailor like his father. The historical record loses track of him after that. Eliza and Nancy both died before their mother, their lives cut short by poverty and the grinding labor of their circumstances. By the time Ona reached old age, everyone she loved was gone. Jack, dead for more than 4 decades. All 3 of her children, dead. Her mother Betty, who had died back at Mount Vernon in January 1795, just months before Ona's escape. Her half-brother Austin, who had drowned in 1794 while traveling between Philadelphia and Virginia, carrying messages for the Washingtons. In her final years, Ona Judge Staines was classified as a legal pauper and received support from Rockingham County. She lived with Nancy and Phyllis Jack, members of the family that had protected her decades earlier, all of them too old now for physical labor. But despite the poverty, despite the loss, despite the unimaginable hardship of her life in freedom, Ona never expressed regret for her choice to escape. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of her story. In 1845, when she was approximately 72 years old, a Baptist minister named Thomas H. Archibald visited her and conducted an interview. His account was published in the Granite Freeman, an abolitionist newspaper in Concord, New Hampshire, on May 22, 1845. 2 years later, on January 1847, another interview appeared in The Liberator, a Boston abolitionist newspaper, conducted by Benjamin Chase. These interviews are extraordinary historical documents. Ona Judge Staines was one of the very few enslaved people from the 18th century whose words were recorded and preserved in their own voice. By the time she gave these interviews, she was too old to have any value as a slave, and anyone who might have helped her escape was long dead. She could finally speak freely. She described her life at Mount Vernon and in Philadelphia. She explained the circumstances of her escape and the reasons behind it. She talked about the Washingtons' attempts to recapture her and how she had evaded them. She protected the names of those who had helped her for nearly 5 decades, saying she didn't want them punished for bringing her away. Most powerfully, she addressed the question that her interviewer asked directly. Wasn't she sorry she had left the Washingtons, given that she had labored so much harder in freedom than she ever did in slavery? Her answer was unequivocal. No, I am free, and have, I trust, been made a child of God by the means. Ona explained that she had never received any mental or moral instruction while enslaved by the Washingtons, but after arriving in Portsmouth, she learned to read. When the evangelist Elias Smith first preached in Portsmouth, she professed to have been converted to Christianity. She attended the South Church regularly in the final decades of her life, worshiping at a church of her own choosing, embracing a faith that she had discovered for herself rather than one imposed by slaveholders. Ona Judge Staines died in Greenland, New Hampshire, on February 25, 1848. She was approximately 75 years old. She had outlived George Washington by nearly 50 years, outlived Martha Washington by 46 years. She had outlived her husband, all her children, most of her siblings, and nearly everyone who had known her in slavery. She died in poverty, but she died free. The story of Ona Judge exposes the central contradiction at the heart of America's founding. George Washington is remembered as the father of the nation, the general who led the Continental Army to victory, the president who established the precedent of peaceful transfer of power, the man who could have been king but chose to be citizen. These accomplishments are real and significant. But Washington was also a man who enslaved over 300 people over the course of his lifetime. He was a man who signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law and then used that law to pursue a young woman who had done nothing except claim her own humanity. He was a man who couldn't see the hypocrisy of writing about liberty while systematically circumventing Pennsylvania's abolition laws to keep human beings in bondage. He was a man who felt betrayed when someone he claimed to treat like a daughter chose freedom over enslavement. Ona Judge's escape challenged the comfortable narrative that enslavers told themselves. The Washingtons genuinely believed they were good masters, that they provided well for their slaves, that their enslaved people were content with their situation. Ona's flight destroyed that illusion. It demonstrated that no amount of fine clothing, no proximity to power, no claims of familial affection could substitute for freedom. The Washingtons' shock and rage at her escape revealed how little they understood about the people they enslaved. They saw gratitude where there was survival. They saw loyalty where there was calculation. They saw contentment where there was suppressed fury. The methods Washington employed to try to recapture Ona tell us everything about the nature of slavery and the slaveholding mindset. He was willing to use deception, having Joseph Whipple lure Ona with a fake job offer. He was willing to use force, authorizing Burwell Bassett to seize her and her children by violence if necessary. But he was also desperate to avoid public scrutiny, insisting that everything be done quietly to protect his reputation. Washington understood that many people in the North viewed slavery as morally repugnant, and he didn't want to be seen as the kind of man who would kidnap a young mother from a free state. He wanted his property back, but he wanted to maintain his image as a statesman above reproach even more. In the end, his reputation mattered more than Ona Judge's freedom, but even his power and prestige couldn't bring her back into bondage. The legal framework that enabled Washington's pursuit of Ona reveals how deeply slavery was embedded in America's founding documents and laws. The Constitution itself, in Article 4, Section 2, guaranteed the property rights of enslavers whose slaves had escaped, establishing federal protection for the institution of slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which Washington signed without apparent hesitation, turned the entire country into a hunting ground for escaped slaves. These weren't unfortunate accidents or regrettable compromises. They were deliberate choices made by men who had the power to choose differently. The same men who wrote about inalienable rights and the consent of the governed created a legal structure that denied basic humanity to millions of people based on the color of their skin. Ona Judge's story also illuminates the networks of resistance that existed in early America. Her escape was not a solo act of desperate courage, though it required enormous bravery. She succeeded because free black communities in Philadelphia and Portsmouth helped her. She succeeded because Captain John Bowles carried her north. She succeeded because Joseph Whipple, despite his position and his debt to Washington, couldn't bring himself to seize her with full force. She succeeded because Senator John Langdon, despite his political ties to Washington, sent her a warning that saved her from kidnapping. She succeeded because the Jack family sheltered her repeatedly over decades. These were white people and black people who understood that slavery was wrong and took risks, some small and some significant, to help one woman claim her freedom. The question of why John Langdon helped Ona is particularly fascinating. He wasn't an abolitionist in the radical sense. He came from a slaveholding family and had owned enslaved people himself. But by 1799, he had freed his enslaved workers and rehired them as paid employees. Something had shifted in his moral calculation. Perhaps it was the changing attitudes in New Hampshire, where anti-slavery sentiment ran high. Perhaps it was his personal relationship with the people he had formerly enslaved, which made their humanity undeniable. Perhaps it was his discomfort with the idea of violent kidnapping in his own city. Whatever the reason, when forced to choose between his political loyalty to Washington and his sense that what Bassett planned to do was wrong, Langdon chose to protect Ona. It was a small act in the grand scheme of things, but for Ona Judge Staines and her infant daughter, it was the difference between freedom and bondage. The interviews Ona gave in her old age raise another profound question. Why did she speak out after decades of silence? By 1845, she had lived free in New Hampshire for nearly 50 years. Why risk drawing attention to herself by granting interviews to abolitionist newspapers? The answer seems to be that Ona understood the power of testimony. The abolitionist movement needed stories, concrete examples that could pierce through the abstract arguments about liberty and property rights. Ona's story was devastating to the mythology of benevolent slavery. Here was a woman who had lived in the president's house, who had worn fine clothes and attended cultural events, who had been treated by all accounts as well as any enslaved person could hope to be treated. And she had risked everything to escape. She had chosen poverty and backbreaking labor and the constant fear of capture over the comfort of enslavement. Her testimony made it impossible to claim that slavery could ever be kind, or that enslaved people were content with their condition. When Ona said, "I am free now and choose to remain so," she was making a statement about human dignity that transcended her individual circumstances. She was asserting that freedom is not something that can be granted or withheld by someone else's beneficence. It is an inherent condition, a birthright that slavery could suppress but never truly destroy. Her willingness to speak decades later, to put her name and her story into the historical record, was an act of defiance as significant as her initial escape. She was claiming space in American history, insisting that the story of the founding era include not just the men who signed documents, but also the people they enslaved, and the ones who fought for their own liberation. Ona Judge Staines died in obscurity, a poor, black woman in a small New Hampshire town. There were no monuments erected in her honor. No newspapers beyond the abolitionist press marked her passing. The mainstream historical narrative continued to celebrate George Washington as an unblemished hero while forgetting the names of the people he enslaved. For more than a century, Ona's story was buried in archives, mentioned briefly, if at all, in accounts of Washington's life. It took generations of historians, particularly black historians and women historians, to excavate these stories and insist on their importance. Today, thanks to scholars like Erica Armstrong Dunbar, whose book Never Caught brought Ona's story to wider attention, we can finally see the founding era more clearly. We can appreciate both Washington's accomplishments and his profound moral failures. We can honor the courage of people like Ona Judge, who fought for their own freedom in whatever ways they could. On February 25, 2008, exactly 160 years after Ona Judge Staines' death, Philadelphia celebrated the first Ona Judge Day at the President's house site, finally acknowledging her story at the place where she had claimed her freedom. In June 2021, a Virginia state historical marker honoring Ona Judge was unveiled near Mount Vernon, the result of a nomination by fifth-grade students who learned her story and believed she deserved recognition. These memorials are important, but they're also long overdue. Ona Judge Staines mattered not because we've chosen to remember her now, but because she always mattered, because her humanity was never diminished by the chains others tried to place on her. Her story asks us to reconsider what we mean when we talk about American history and American heroes. It challenges us to see the founding era as it actually was, a time of soaring rhetoric about freedom and grinding reality of slavery, of brilliant political innovation and brutal human exploitation. It reminds us that for every founding father whose face appears on currency, there were hundreds of enslaved people whose labor built this nation and whose names we'll never know. Ona Judge was one of the lucky ones. Not because her life was easy, it wasn't, but because she escaped, and because she lived long enough to tell her story in her own words. The last word should be hers. When asked if she regretted leaving the Washingtons, given everything that freedom had cost her, Ona Judge Staines said no. She was free, and she had been made a child of God by the means. She had chosen the hardship of freedom over the comfort of bondage, and she never looked back. That choice, made by a 22-year-old woman on a spring evening in 1796, echoes across American history. It reminds us that liberty is not something granted by the powerful to the powerless. It is something claimed by individuals who understand their own worth, even when the law and society conspire to deny it. Ona Judge claimed her freedom and held on to it for 52 years through poverty, loss, and unimaginable hardship. She died as she had lived the second half of her life, a free woman on her own terms. That is her legacy, and that is why we remember her name.